Hi, everybody. This is the first lecture for our economics chapter. It's chapter 6 in our textbook. And this is going to continue. When we study economics here in chapter 6, we're going to continue with some of the same examples and certainly the lifestyles that we've been learning about, the differing lifestyles we've been learning about in the subsistence strategy chapter. So we're going to use examples of like horticulture or pastoralism or any of the 5 subsistence strategies that we've learned about so far in this economics chapter. Okay, first let me say a little thing about economics in general. When I was an undergraduate student like you are today, I majored in something called international studies. I chose a business focus so that I could be involved in like international business negotiations and international cultures and things like this. And in part of my degree, I had to take 3 economics classes that were like in the College of Business. They were in the business school. And it was microeconomic principles of economics in general, and then I had to take more specific classes on microeconomics and macroeconomics. And let me just confess to you right now that those classes, still to this day, were like my nightmare classes. I just barely got a high enough grade for them to count toward my degree. And honestly, they could have been the reason why I wasn't able to get that degree as an undergraduate. I managed to go ahead and get that lowest grade. I certainly didn't want the lowest grade that would let me skim by. I wanted, a higher grade. But I'm telling you this just because economics is not usually something that people just think about, loving. Most of us just don't love it. And in my case, I just kind of didn't understand how the math and the supply and demand curves and all these kinds of things that we studied in the College of Business economics classes, that just wasn't really the way my brain worked. I'm much more of a liberal arts brain than that. So when I was taking cultural anthropology and we got to an economics chapter in cultural anthropology, I'd been loving this stuff. I'd been loving this class up until that point, and I turned the page and it said economics as the title of as the chapter, and I thought, oh no, I thought I loved this class, and now all of a sudden I've got to deal with economics again. But I am so happy that I had an open mind, and I'm so happy that I stayed in that class despite the fact of dreading having to deal with economics again, because when we talk about economics in cultural anthropology, we have a much broader scope than, say, a College of Business or a financial scope that companies and corporations have, and the business world and target markets and all this kind of stuff that you have with an industrialized subsistence strategy. We have to zoom out, we cultural anthropologists have to zoom out with economics and look at how it is really the core of every relationship that we have with people in all of our lives. So even though we have already learned, for instance, that foragers do not have surplus, they do not try to take more from the natural environment than they need just to survive on a daily basis. And they try to be very respectful with the environment to not damage it, so they can always have, to the best of their ability, they always have like a predictable amount of food available. And so there are economic relationships even there where there's no price tag on food, and food is considered something like a basic human right that wouldn't be deprived, no one would be deprived of food, for instance, in a foraging society or horticulture society or pastoral society, for instance. So there's still economics at play there, even where you don't have price tags and market demand and stuff like that. So we're going to look at economics in anthropology class with that broader scope, okay? So bear with me if you are like I used to be and just really dread, words like production, distribution, and consumption. Bear with me, because hopefully we will be able to put this more into the liberal arts kind of realm, so you can see how this topic applies as the basis of all human relationships. Okay, so on the screen behind me, let me put my trusty eyeballs on. There we go, so I can see it. So on the screen behind me, you see a photograph that I took of one of my face-to-face classes when I was talking about economics for the first time with them. So economics in anthropology, it is a behavior science. It is, because it is the study of how people behave as far as exchanges go within their particular culture. So exchanging things, whether it's work, whether it is goods and services. I've got goods and services written over here. So however an exchange happens, whether it's I'll do this work for you, you do that work for me, that is considered an economic exchange. So one of the things you have to unlearn in this chapter about economics is that just like when we were talking about making a living in the other chapters, you don't you have to unlearn what we think of making a living. It's not always about having a paycheck so you can pay your bills. Quite often, making a living simply just means how are you going to survive from day to day, right? So with economics, we have to, as cultural anthropologists, we have to remember that it doesn't always equate to money or the value of something that we're going to purchase, or the goods and the services. For instance, maybe the goods are, the fish that you just collected from your weir, which is a fish trap that you can put out, and go and collect fish that swam in it and couldn't get out. So maybe that's the goods that are going to be collected in production, distributed, and consumed by people. But or the services is who made that weir. It's a basket that you have to weave. So who made that, for instance? So it doesn't have to, when you're thinking of goods and services, don't think of things you have to pay for necessarily, because remember, not every subsistence strategy we've studied has like a cost or supply and demand or surplus goods at all. So you have to back off of what you think you know about reality, because the only thing you know about reality is our version of reality. And there's lots of different cultural ways around the world. So keep that in mind. So economics is the study of all the different cultural ways, all the different cultural habits that people have around the world that govern the exchange system that exists in that, within their society. And that, the set of norms, the set of symbols that go with that exchange symbol, that exchange system, they're going to be very different from one place to the next. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind and unlearn the stuff that we think we know already. Okay, so one thing that you need to know about every single economic system anywhere, and when I say economic system, each of the different subsistence strategies are going to have a different set of customs or behaviors associated with doing these three things. So the customs and the behavior associated with doing these three things that I'm going to tell you about are going to differ from one economic structure or system to the next, but every economic system has these three components as part of it. Okay? So production, distribution, and consumption, these are three components that you will find in every single economic system around. Okay? Someone has to actually gather or hunt, forage for the food. If you're a forager, someone actually has to cultivate the food. If you're a horticulturalist, someone actually has to practice animal husbandry techniques. If you are a pastoralist, for instance, if you're an agriculturalist, you have to manage the land and manage the fertilizer, manage all these kinds of things. All of those activities, all those behaviors would be part of how you produce the food that your immediate cultural group needs. Okay. So there's going to be different customs of production depending upon what your social structure is like, or depending upon what your economic system is like. There's going to be a different set of rules that governs how production takes place. But production is part of every single system, economic system. Okay, distribution is also a part of every single economic system. So if there are 5 or 6 people in your foraging band, and and those 5 or 6 people are really good at deer hunting, for instance, you've got more people than 5 or 6 in your foraging group, but 5 or 6 of the foraging group are really good at hunting. but there are 25 other people who aren't very good at hunting. Well, those 4 or 5 people who are good at hunting are always going to be the ones who go out and hunt, because you need to be able to have an expectation that they're going to produce something. So you're going to send your best folks out to do it. But when they bring that deer back to the village or back to the camp, wherever you are at the moment, everybody in the camp needs to eat. So there's going to be some sort of distribution habit associated with foraging, to keep with my example, so that everybody gets the share of what is going to be produced. How large the share is going to be has to do with the consumption that people, what kind of quantities of the goods or the services that are being distributed, what kind of quantities do each person need. Like the hunters probably need a higher quantity just because they, exerted themselves physically to go out and get it. Whereas your grandma, who is really good at passing down knowledge and teaching the younger generations all the tricks that she knows about how to be a successful forager, she doesn't need as many calories as those hunters did. So the distribution and the consumption would be like the rules that govern those things would correspond to the need that the hunter has as compared to the need that the grandma has, right, and everybody else. But in foraging, the economic system would be that everybody does get a part of what is produced distributed to them in the quantity, there's your consumption, in the quantity that you need in order to be successful at whatever the division of labor says is your responsibility in the society. So those are the types of, customs and behaviors that would be associated with the economic system specific to foragers, for instance, since I've used that example. Okay, so economics is the basis of all human relationships. I've said that like 5 or 6 times so far, and I'm going to get to some details about that in just a second. But before I do that, let me make it even a broader statement, and it's not just about human relationships, it's about the way we make decisions too. So let me go to this next picture that I took from class the other day when I was talking about this with my face-to-face classes. And let's talk about a core concept in this chapter that you're going to have to try to wrap your brain around, because most of the remaining topics from this chapter are going to correspond to economizing behavior, the first thing that you see on the board here in this image I'm showing you. So economizing behavior is the core kind of thought process that we have as human beings. Economizing behavior refers to the way we make decisions that we perceive we're going to have the most benefit from, either as an individual or as a cultural group. So it would depend on your enculturation process. Do you think first of individuals? Do you think first of your immediate household? We're going to talk about this word in just a second. That's the core economic unit in society. Do you think about yourself as an individual first, and that's how you make your decisions, where you perceive you individually get the most benefit? Is it a household kind of decision? Is it an entire cultural group kind of decision? So any kind of decision-making process where you make a choice based on what you perceive is going to be the most benefit, the choice that's going to give you the most benefit, that's called economizing behavior. And really, it is the basis of all human relationships, whether we build a relationship, keep a relationship, break up a relationship. And it's not just about relationships with human beings. You have economic relationships with your mobile devices, for instance. If your battery is running down too quickly, you're going to make an economizing decision, maybe to spend more money on a new device or on a faster charger or something like that. So even though you might be spending more, you're making it's an economizing behavior kind of decision in order to go and buy that extra charger or something, or upgrade your computer in general because it's crashing all the time or something like that. So you have economic relationships with the stuff around you also. I had a dog once. I love dogs. I had one of my dogs one time. I just could not keep her in the yard. I tried everything. I just couldn't. It was causing so much trouble, and she was friendly, so nobody really minded too much when, she showed up on their front porch when I was gone to work. But it was a big hassle, and it was causing me way too much worry, and I loved the dog. She was really sweet, but I had to get rid of her. That was an economizing behavior. I had to give her to a friend of mine who lives out in the middle of nowhere, where she had like 20 miles to run every single day and couldn't get hit by a car and die, or the chances were less that she would get, hit by a car and die. So I had to make, and that was an economizing behavior thing, decision that I made. This dog mattered to me. I loved her. I wanted her around me, but I couldn't. It wasn't feasible. And so I perceived that it was the most benefit for me and the dog to find a different house to go and live in. So economizing behavior is part of really all of the decision-making process that we do. And so it's part of cognitive anthropology, and it's part of the way we build relationships, like adopt a dog in the first place, or decide to pass the dog on to a new owner, like I had to do, and break up that relationship. So economizing behavior is one of these core things that we have to think about through all of our discussions in this chapter. Okay, so the smallest economic unit in society is something called a household. So I posted that right there. Household is a term that we use in anthropology not to refer to the dwelling itself. Please do not think that I'm referring to the dwelling itself. I'm referring to the people who immediately live in whatever kind of dwelling is part of your culture's norms, the people who immediately live there. So among the Yanomami, for instance, when we read that article from Napoleon Chagnon for our Project 1 in this class, we read that they have like this little village that's kind of round, and all of the different households where a man might live with his wives and children might be right next door without even a wall separating them from another man and his children. But each man with his wife and his children is a household. It's the people, not the building itself, not the dwelling itself. Okay, so keep that in mind. So if you have people who form a household, in anthropology what that means is it's the smallest economic unit of society that is not necessarily, I misspelled the word not, can you see that? It's not necessarily family, meaning blood or marriage kin. I wrote it like this on the board because our next unit is going to be about kinship and what we actually mean by that in anthropology. So I've got this, highlighted or emphasized with quotation marks. So household is not necessarily family members like maybe you and I have or we assume people in our culture includes only blood or marriage relatives within their immediate household. But it's not about necessarily people you share bloodline or marriage with. It's people who share economic cooperation. Meaning, you produce what needs to be produced so that all of the members are taken care of. You distribute those goods and services to all of the members of the household, and you consume at different rates. So for instance, if you do have an apartment, let's say you have a 2-bedroom apartment, and you have an electric bill that you have to pay for the 2-bedroom apartment. Well, you have to produce an income of some sort, whether it's a stipend, whether it's a voucher, whether it is your Pell Grant, whether it is your paycheck. You have to produce something to get that service in your household because it's part of our cultural norms to have that, right? And you don't just have the electricity hooked up to your kitchen in your apartment, you have it distributed to all of the rooms because there's going to be people living in all the rooms. Well, maybe you have a 2-bedroom apartment and you live alone. So even though there's going to be electricity going to that second bedroom, maybe you rarely turn it on. Maybe you rarely open the door. Maybe you rarely even use that room and keep it closed off and just for storage or something. But you're still going to have electricity available to it. So think about how all of the rooms in an apartment might have, electrical service distributed to them. Well, all of the members of a household, whether the dwelling itself is an apartment or not, all of the members of a household are going to need to benefit from whatever is produced. So there's going to be rules for distributing that stuff among the people. And then consumption might occur at different levels based on the work that the people do, their body size, their, whatever the needs are, whatever the customs and the behaviors are associated with that particular economic system. They will be observable. Those customs and behaviors will be observable on the smallest level in what we call the household. Okay? This is not a description of a dwelling, it's the people in it. So let me talk about this funny picture I have on the board over here. So in this class, when I drew this stuff on the board, there were some questions about, what do you mean the people, and let's talk about how production, distribution, consumption can happen with all these people. So I drew these symbols. The triangle and the circle represent a male is the triangle and the circle is a female. This, what looks like an equal sign, don't call it an equal sign with me though. This is not an equal sign, and this is not a triangle, this is a male, and that's not a circle, that's a female, and that's not an equal sign, that represents a sexual union, okay? You can call it a marriage if you would like, but not all cultures have the same customs for marriages that we do, and also, there's different kinds of assumptions about whether sexual activity is going to be involved in all marriages or not. We'll get to that. We will get to that later, in the next unit. But these symbols that I'm explaining to you now, we're going to use those symbols a lot in our next unit because you're going to be required to watch videos like this where I show you how to draw way, way, way more complex kinship diagrams than just this little simple one right here. So I drew this little simple one right here to try to explain how production, distribution, and consumption can happen within a household. So for instance, let's say that there is a household that has a male and a female that have produced 3 children. And that's how you should interpret this. So if you have this line coming out of that sexual union symbol, and you have this line connecting all of them, and you've got these down lines right there, you've got a daughter, a son, and a son that have come from this sexual union. So here are the people who are participating in my fictitious household that I'm using as an example right now. Okay. So this row of people, these are the adults, and this row is the children. So adults and children, males and females, are going to produce different levels of things for the household and different types of things for the household, depending upon the gender roles that are appropriate in society or expected in society, and depending upon the age and capacity of the people involved. So let's use traditional American or estadounidense gender roles of provider and caregiver. So those are traditional, and some might say outdated, but let's think about those traditional gender roles for just a second, and let's talk about how both of those gender roles are producers in this economic system. So provider traditionally goes with the male, right? A caregiver traditionally goes with the female, right? So that would mean that the male would have in the division of labor between those two groups, the male would be the one who brings in the resources necessary in that particular economic culture. So let's use industrialism. So in other words, the main resource that the male would need to bring into the household is money. Let's say that the caregiver does not bring in money from the outside. So we're going like way back in history, many females do. So I know that. We're just using a very simplified children's book kind of version of this for just a second. So the female, even though she might not go into society to bring in cash money into the household, there's a whole lot of production of services that she provides in that household that if she was gone, if she was not present, this male would have to pay someone in order to do it. So pretty much everything in the household in the traditional gender role. You've got to keep it clean, keep these people clean, keep them fed, a good diet, do the grocery shopping, pay all of the bills, make sure that upkeep and maintenance and all this kind of stuff. I mean, keep on going, right? There's a long, long list that in the traditional gender roles, this person is responsible for. That has an economic production quality to it because it's work that benefits everybody. So when the male brings in money from the outside, or the female, or vice versa, in some modern day alternatives to these traditional gender roles, when the female produces work, completes work that is a household necessity, there still has to be a distribution of some of those funds or some of those services. Decisions have to be made about how do we distribute that. So if these are teeny tiny kids, maybe they are breastfeeding or something, or one of them is breastfeeding or something, the female is going to need a larger distributed amount of food, for instance, in order to keep up with breast milk production so that baby here has enough until baby is eating solid food also. So there might be, the way you make decisions about distributing the resources that are in your household might have to change from time to time. When these people are babies, they might not eat nearly as, they definitely, let me just tell you, they do not eat as much as like a 13 or 14-year-old male. I cannot believe how much those children ate. When they were in my household, you could not keep groceries in the house. When they were 13 and 14 years old, they could just had a hollow leg. They would eat, right? So the distribution of food for them is going to change over the years. And so you have to have somebody manage all that too. And so traditionally, that's the female gender role. And then the consumption, of course, I've tied that into this conversation too. Everybody might need different amounts of consumption. If the female is breastfeeding, certainly she's going to need to consume more in that circumstance than if she is finished with breastfeeding and not pregnant with anybody. So anyway, the consumption rules are going to be different. Maybe you have production and some of the distribution ideas. I remember that my mother had, in the house when we were growing up, my mother had a cabinet in the kitchen that was off limits to the kids, but the adults kept their stuff in there. There were things like cheese curls, and there were things like, I don't know, Cokes. We didn't get Cokes very often. My parents didn't drink Cokes very often either. But, there was a cabinet that was for kind of junk food that the adults could have and the kids couldn't, because that was a decision that was made with the provider and the caregiver in my household, that there would be these things that were off limits. They would not be distributed to the kids. Only on very special occasions. They would not be consumed by the kids on a regular basis. They would be withheld. And so all of those different rules that might go on in your household today, that household is the tiniest economic unit in society where all of these things are going on, all of them. And the way that you make those decisions about who produces what, who gets what, how much they get, those are all these questions that go along with production, distribution, and consumption. So on the micro scale in the household, these behaviors are happening. And on the larger scale in society itself, those behaviors are happening. So whether you are from a foraging group with the smallest population density, nomadic, or you're in industrialized society where we have cities that, 10 million people in one city is not unheard of, from any other population density or subsistence strategy in between, there are economizing behaviors that go on about how to use the resources that are available in society. There are practices and customs specific to that subsistence strategy that play out in the day-to-day norms that go with production, distribution, and consumption. And that's the way you make decisions about how people are going to cooperate economically together. Okay? So The next video that you're going to watch about this gets into the deeper kind of philosophical way that economics defines our relationships. We're going to look at the way like parents or your immediate caregiver and the children, the people you're immediately in charge of, how the economic decisions and how the economic relationship plays out with that. We're going to look at friendships and how economics is the basis of friendships. If I always need you to be a shoulder to cry on, and I always need to borrow money from you and all this kind of stuff, and I'm never there for you when you know the shoe's on the other foot, well, our friendship's not going to last very long because economically we don't have a balance. And so we'll talk about that, and we'll also talk about when surplus is part of a society and profit is the focus. How does that change economics? And, you know, if we buy something at a for-profit place, like, you know, I go to Dollar General a lot, well, Dollar General is very affordable. I like them, but they are not a charitable organization. You know, they are making money off me, even though I feel like, you know, my 4 plastic cups for $1 is a really good deal. After I get them out of the washing machine 3 or 4 times and they got cracks in them, I feel like I haven't wasted too much money, but Dollar General made money off me when I bought that. But that was okay with me. I was willing to give my dollar and get those 4 plastic cups, or 6, I think it was, for $1. But anyway, they made money off me. They weren't giving me anything. They weren't making a loss, right? So we're going to talk about those kinds of relationships. How do we maintain relationships? How do they break up? It's called reciprocity, and it is part of the next. It's part of the next lecture that you'll see face to face with you know, students asking questions and answering questions. So that's what's up next in your unit. Please make sure you rewind this or back it up, whatever word you say these days, since you're watching it on YouTube, and take good notes from this. You're going to need it for Project 3 because you're going to have to analyze scenarios that I'm describing to you in Project 3 and take some of this information and, you know, to use it to figure out those scenarios. So I will see you in the next video. Bye.